Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short video, we'll follow up on our discussion about the value proposition. We've already talked about in a prior video what the value proposition is, a little information about pains and gains, and understanding the distinction between a full launch versus incremental testing. We want to think a little bit more about the basic principles for that incremental testing approach. So we're trying to develop multiple theories to test around the MVP, or the minimum viable product. That is, the simplest product that can be offered to customers that they will actually pay for. So really, this is about designing an experiment. Asking the appropriate questions, structuring the experiment, and figuring out the basic statistics that will give us the information about whether customers are getting value from the product or service as we envision it. And the more information that we can generate quickly, the better off we are. The hardest part about this is usually being prepared to be wrong in our hypothesis. So for example, you have the idea that people will pay more for a lightweight hammer, and you do some research, and it turns out that in fact, while a lightweight hammer might work, people want a heavier hammer because it's either easier to use, or because it feels better, or because they're just used to it in the past. Many entrepreneurs create experiments, and then when they test them, they discover that their hypotheses were wrong, but they refuse to accept the possibility that they actually need to change what they're doing. In order to build or test a good theory, we have to carefully articulate what the value proposition is. That is the theory for why our business will succeed. We have to think about some of the unknowns that are likely to be that we would want to address, and the risk that those unknowns pose to us. And then we want to design our MVP to test the key assumptions. We might have a brochure, we might create a wireframe if this is a mobile app or desktop software. Or if we're really lucky, we can create a full prototype to allow people to actually experience the technology or the product and see if it works. And then as we get feedback, we could revise that. And we talked in class about the idea of opening a restaurant and figuring out less expensive ways to test whether or not a specific type of restaurant could be successful. You may recall we talked about different types of noodle restaurants, in particular a faux noodle restaurant, and the idea that we could launch an entire restaurant, but there might be other tests that we could run, such as opening a food cart, or even, for example, setting up a stand in a dormitory or a university building, giving out free samples or inexpensive samples, and gauging the response of customers to figure out whether it was working or not. Ultimately, these are the kinds of things that we want to use in order to determine whether or not a value proposition is actually viable. A really interesting example of how a value proposition might differ significantly from what prior expectations were is the launch of the Nintendo Wii back in 2006. I don't know how many of you may have actually played on a Nintendo Wii. If you've never done so, it's actually quite fun, and you might want to track one down and use it. It's a very different sort of gaming experience. The argument that was made at the time that Nintendo was in the process of launching the Wii was thinking about who are stereotypical gamers and what do they look like while gaming. And I imagine if you just take a moment and sort of think to yourself, what do gamers look like? So imagine that image in your head, and then here's the question for you. Is this roughly what you were thinking about, right? So maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, not completely clear. But if this is sort of what you were thinking about in terms of what stereotypical gamers are, you probably wouldn't be alone. But Nintendo had a different theory about what the gaming business could actually look like. And so they launched the Wii despite a lot of concerns from people in the industry. And this is, and I'm hoping this is going to work on this video, this is one of the trailers that they use to actually try to market the product and the technology. I don't know whether you can actually hear the sound associated with this or not, but you might notice that there's a lot of differences in what they're showing as far as the gamers. Um, where the gamers are, they're standing, they're not sitting. The demographics of the gamers is very different than we saw in that other picture. Is this who you thought of when you imagined gamers? Maybe not. You'll also notice that they're showing it as very much a family or social event as compared to the two guys sitting by themselves in an apartment. So I think you've gotten the idea for what we're talking about here. So when we think about this, this helps us understand a little bit about how the value proposition links to the target customer, right? So the end user and the champion in this example is a little bit different than it might have been for the type of target customer that you are thinking about. It could potentially be that kind of person, someone who, for example, owns a PlayStation or an Xbox, but we're also beginning to try to expand our definition for what a new gamer might look like. And here, the economic buyer might be quite different. In the case of the gamers that we originally were looking at, it might have been themselves, or if they're a little bit younger, maybe their parents. But in the context of the Nintendo Wii, the economic buyer could be a family. It could be adults buying a game set for their parents who are a little bit older. And the influencers in this situation also might be different. There might be peers involved, but there also might be friends or colleagues or even other families who are suggesting, yeah, this gaming system works very, very differently. You then want to, in this kind of scenario, compare the possible to the reality. So you want to consider what your value proposition possible is to what the customer wants and actually gets from what they currently have. And this is what was so powerful about Nintendo's Wii launch, because on the whole, the target customer that they were going after had nothing at all. Those customers were not people who had previously bought gaming systems for themselves, and they weren't going to be buying those kinds of games in order to do the sorts of first-person shooter or aircraft or spaceship games. They were doing this as part of a completely different kind of social activity that was maybe not athletic, but at least active. Going through this process requires you to be very honest, to focus on the customer's perspective, not your personal perspective. And keep in mind that if you are going after a B2B market, that is, you're targeting businesses rather than consumers, remember that business customers tend to be more cost-focused and quantitative than consumers do. We can see how you could unintentionally misunderstand the Wii's advantage by looking at some of the quantitative elements here. We generally like data. We definitely want to use quantitative information wherever possible, but this is a situation where you need to be really careful about it. If, for example, you were looking at the Wii versus, for example, the PlayStation 3, which was the PlayStation version that was available at the time, you might discover that the PlayStation had dramatically better specifications across a number of different factors. The key one being its speed. And so the idea that the PS3 was dramatically faster than the Wii might have caused you to think, well, maybe that's the important thing. Maybe the Wii doesn't have any chance to compete because the PS3 is so much faster than the Wii is going to be. But in reality, it's some of the other factors that drove the success of the Nintendo Wii. One was it's a much lower entry price for people who weren't focused on performance. And this aspect that fun was really the driving factor here. And of course, we can drop a couple of these factors out as being irrelevant. Nobody really cared how heavy it was, and nobody really cared about the power consumption. So as we use quantitative information, we need to keep in mind that you can't just use all the quantitative data you have. You have to pick out the quantitative data that really makes a difference. So there's lots of characteristics of great value propositions. This is from Alexander Osterwalder's value proposition canvas analysis. They're embedded in great business models, so they don't exist on their own. We do want to think about the business model of the organization. They focus on the jobs, pains, and gains that really matter to customers. Where possible, they focus on the opportunities of unsatisfied jobs, unresolved pains, and unrealized gains. And they tend to target very few of them, but they do it extremely well. So this is a great, the Nintendo Wii was a great example of it. Nintendo didn't worry about how fast the processors were run so long as it appeared to be fun to the users. Where possible, you'd like your value proposition to go beyond just the purely functional jobs, that is, what it does. The Nintendo Wii, for example, simply renders games and makes them playable, and address emotional and social jobs, right? And this is where the Wii was so powerful, because it helped people have fun with people they liked hanging around with, targeting a customer base that had not really seen gaming as a social activity in the past. It has to align with how customers measure success. Remember, it's not what you think is important, it's what the customer thinks are important. You have to focus on the issues that people really want addressed and that some will pay a lot of money for. Wherever you can, differentiate from your competition on those specific factors, just like the Wii did, and outperform on at least one specific dimension, and if at all possible, make it difficult to copy. So the most common value proposition problems, that whatever it is you're creating is just a feature extension for someone else's product. That might be a nice starting point, but there's a good chance that that other organization will be able to replicate it. Sometimes the value proposition for an innovation is that it's nice to have, but isn't got to have. Remember back to our innovation marketplace, where we realized that people's behavior is difficult to change, and nice to have may not be sufficient to change their behavior. And then sometimes the market is just too small. Not enough people care about the specific value proposition that you're trying to provide. Keep in mind that the same product could have very different value propositions. So here's a product that you may be familiar with. And if you happen to be a college student, this probably accomplishes a very specific goal. It's cheap and it's quick and it's filling. And if you're a college student who is relatively poor, just doesn't have a lot of ready cash around, and you don't have a car perhaps, so you can't drive anywhere, and you're looking to get as much food as possible for the money, this could be a very good solution. But it may be a very different value proposition, for example, for parents of small children for whom everything is associated around convenience. They might have been willing to pay more, but the critical thing was that they could obtain something that the small children are pretty much guaranteed to eat, and it's available precisely when they need it. And so this is something that you may want to think about in terms of how products can serve different markets with different value propositions. So key takeaways here: getting your value proposition right for your target segments, one of the most important things that an entrepreneur does. If your value proposition doesn't fit your target customer segment's needs, the odds are good you're not going to be successful. You might have to be creative in thinking about what your value proposition might be relative to your competition. Remember the Nintendo Wii. The gaming industry had moved on very specific criteria for performance characteristics for many years, and the Wii completely changed how we thought about the gaming market. And then whenever possible, test your theory with your target customers. So I hope that this has provided you with some useful information as you think about value proposition, whether for this course or for any venture that you might choose to get involved in.